Welcome to Hourglass Secrets. In the quiet, mist-shrouded fields of early 20th century Ireland, a terrible secret was brewing. It was a time when the land still carried the scars of famine, and families scraped a living from the soil, bound to routines that rarely wavered. But in Clonbrock, among the modest cottages and black-dusted farmland, one family's life was about to be shattered by betrayal, lust, and unthinkable violence. Tonight, we step into a story so dark and gripping that even generations later it sends chills down the spine. A murder not whispered about in the shadows, but spoken of in every nearby hamlet. Mary Bridget Byrne, born in 1865, had grown up in a rural community where hard work defined every day, and education, though modest, offered a glimpse of something beyond the fields. By the time she married John Daly, a diligent coal carrier, life seemed steady, almost peaceful. They settled on a 5-acre holding near Clonbrock, welcoming 2 children in quick succession, a boy, John, and a daughter, Elizabeth. On the surface, everything appeared as it should, a farming family managing their small plot, the husband working long hours, the wife tending the home and children. But beneath this facade, dissatisfaction and desire quietly festered. The local community, small and observant, began murmuring about Mary's friendship with Joseph Taylor, a neighbour 12 years her junior. To the casual observer, it was merely improper familiarity. But as days turned into months, whispers hinted at a relationship that was growing dangerously intimate. John Daly, exhausted from his long journeys delivering coal, was unaware of the storm gathering around him. Or perhaps he suspected, but could not yet grasp the depth of betrayal waiting at his own doorstep. On the 16th of June 1902, John set out as usual to deliver coal to Carlow. Neighbours later recalled seeing him hurrying unusually along the road, urging his horse forward with a speed that seemed out of character. That evening he returned home, unharnessed the horse, and allowed it to graze in the field behind the house. A routine act, one might think, but it would become the final moments of a life soon to be cut short. The following morning, the boy discovered his father's motionless body, sprawled in the wet grass, blood seeping into the soil he had laboured over for years. A deep sense of dread gripped the family, yet Mary's initial reaction was not one of frantic alarm. Instead, she paused, seemingly calculating her next move, before alerting authorities hours later. The scene was horrifying, a violent assault evident in the fractured skull and the blood-stained earth. This was not a robbery, nor a simple accident. It was murder. The villagers, curious and uneasy, gathered as the inquest began. Stories of Mary's closeness to Taylor, of heated arguments and secret rendezvous surfaced. The evidence was stark, the sorrow palpable, and the question on everyone's lips was clear. Who could commit such a brutal act, and why? Before we begin, please hit subscribe and tell me, what state are you listening from? The morning sun rose over Clonbrock, but the light did little to ease the grim shadow that had fallen over the Daly household. John Daly's body lay in the field, the evidence of a violent struggle stark against the green grass. It was a scene that would haunt those who saw it for the rest of their lives. For the villagers who had come to know the family, it was more than a tragedy. It was a shock that tore through the fabric of their quiet community. Mary's children, young and frightened, had stumbled upon their father in a way that no child should ever have to. The boy, John Jr., ran to his mother, his small frame shaking, reporting what he had seen. She followed him to the field, surveying the lifeless figure of the man who had been the centre of her world, and for reasons that would later provoke suspicion, she did not immediately summon help. Hours passed before the police were finally notified, giving the air of the day a heavy, unsettling tension. As the investigation began, officers were struck by the violent nature of the assault. John Daly's head bore the marks of both blunt and sharp implements, signs of a struggle that had been intense and deliberate. The surrounding field displayed traces of movement and dragging, suggesting that the body had been moved after the initial attack. Every detail pointed to a crime committed with cold intent rather than passion. Word of Mary's relationship with Joseph Taylor had already begun to circulate, and the authorities quickly brought him in for questioning. Taylor, living a mere stone's throw from the Daly home, had been observed in the area at suspicious times, and the rumours of his closeness with Mary painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. It seemed increasingly clear that this was not a simple act of violence. It was entwined with betrayal, jealousy, and long simmering tensions. The coroner, Dr. Higgins, convened an inquest in the nearby town of Plumbrook. The courtroom was crowded with local magistrates, police, and residents drawn by curiosity and the need to witness justice unfolding. Witnesses recounted what they had seen and heard. John Jr.'s testimony was particularly haunting. He described the scene in the field, the struggle, and Mary's presence nearby, a silent, observing figure as violence was enacted before his eyes. Neighbouring villagers spoke of arguments, of John Daly's drinking, and of the escalating tension between him, his wife, and Taylor. The image that emerged was of a household fractured by desire and resentment, where small rural grievances had grown into dangerous obsessions. For the jury and the onlookers, it became evident that the quiet life of the Daly family had been a fragile illusion, shattered in a single night by actions that would forever stain the green fields of Clonbrock. The inquest concluded that John Daly had been willfully murdered, though the precise perpetrator remained unknown. Yet the threads of suspicion were tightening around Mary and Taylor, whose connection to the tragedy was now impossible to ignore. The stage was set for the next act, where secrets would be exposed, and the question of guilt would begin to unravel in the eyes of the law. By mid-June 1902, the quiet countryside around Clonbrock was buzzing with whispers, speculation, and a growing sense of unease. The tragic death of John Daly had shaken the community, and as police dug deeper, the story that unfolded was far darker than anyone had anticipated. It was no longer merely a murder. It was a tale entwined with betrayal, illicit desire, and calculated deception. Evidence collected at the scene painted a chilling picture. Officers noted the violent nature of Daly's injuries, both blunt and sharp, indicating repeated attacks with deliberate intent. Marks in the wet grass suggested that his body had been dragged, a grim indication of the struggle that had taken place under the cover of night. But what intrigued investigators most was the behavior of those closest to him. Mary Daly, calm and methodical, had delayed notifying authorities and had given instructions to her children that later seemed designed to mislead the investigation. In the eyes of law enforcement, her composure was not comforting. It was suspicious. Attention soon focused on Joseph Taylor, the neighbour whose relationship with Mary had long been the subject of whispered speculation. Living only a few hundred yards from the Daly home, he was brought in for questioning. Witnesses recounted seeing the two together in ways that were far from innocent, and past arguments between John Daly and the pair suggested tensions had escalated over time. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture of conspiracy, though concrete evidence was still needed to link Taylor and Mary directly to the brutal act. On the 26th of June, after careful examination of statements and the gathering of supporting evidence, both Mary Daly and Joseph Taylor were formally charged with the murder of John Daly. For the first time, the rural community felt the grip of justice closing in, and the news spread cues. Ickly, sparking shock, curiosity, and horror. Families who had known the Dalys for generations now whispered about secret liaisons, hidden resentments, and a night of violence that had transformed a familiar household into a crime scene. Preparations for the trials began, drawing legal teams and public attention alike. Joseph Taylor's trial was set to precede Mary Daly's, a strategic decision by the court. The courtroom became a theatre of anticipation. Every witness, every account of arguments, late-night movements, and suspicious behaviour would be scrutinised for signs of guilt. The press and local residents clamoured to witness proceedings, and the case became a focal point of conversation in Clonbrock and beyond. Meanwhile, the Daly children, too young to fully understand the gravity of what had occurred, were caught in the eye of the storm. Their testimonies would later become critical, recounting scenes from that night with the raw innocence and horror of children thrust into a violent adult world. Mary's actions, her calm in the morning, her instructions to mislead authorities, cast long shadows over her, fueling speculation that she may have played a more active role than initially evident. As the community awaited the unfolding of justice, the tension was palpable. The story of the Dalys was no longer just a family tragedy. It had become a cautionary tale of desire, deception, and the consequences of hidden betrayals. The quiet fields of Clonbrock had witnessed a horror that would be remembered for decades, as the law prepared to determine the fate of those accused. As December arrived in 1902, the courtroom in Clonbrock was filled to capacity, its benches crowded with townsfolk and press eager to witness the case that had captured the entire county. The murder of John Daly had transformed from a grim local tragedy into a sensational story of betrayal, lust, and shocking violence. The air was thick with anticipation, every eye on the accused, Joseph Taylor, as the trial began. Prosecution opened their case with an unflinching account of the events leading to Daly's death. They alleged that Taylor, emboldened and encouraged by Mary Daly, had carried out the fatal attack. Witnesses described seeing the two together at odd hours, often when John was away working long hours transporting coal. Most damning were the statements from John Jr., who recounted hearing the struggle late at night and seeing his father dragged across the yard into the fields, Mary's presence nearby casting an ominous shadow. The child's testimony was chilling in its simplicity. He had seen violence and feared for his father's life, yet no one had come to stop it. Neighbours testified to the ongoing affair between Mary and Taylor, describing behaviour that went far beyond mere friendship. Heated arguments in the Daly household were mentioned repeatedly, particularly those that followed John's complaints about his wife and the younger man. Some witnesses recalled John's drinking, though all emphasised his generally good nature. The court was left to grapple with a picture of a household strained by passion, resentment, and concealed desires. The medical evidence was equally damning. Dr. Lane and Dr. McKenna outlined the severity of John Daly's injuries. 12 severe blows to the head, consistent with being struck repeatedly by blunt and sharp instruments. The coroner's report confirmed death from internal bleeding, caused by fractures to the skull, the brutal. It left no doubt that this was not a crime of opportunity or anger in the moment. It had been committed with deliberate force and intent. After careful deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for Joseph Taylor. The court found him responsible for the murder, and despite his pleas of innocence, he was sentenced to death by hanging, which was carried out on 7th of January 1903. The courtroom's focus then shifted to Mary Daly, whose trial promised to be equally riveting. Her proceedings began shortly after, with the courtroom again packed with spectators. The prosecution laid out her role, that she had encouraged Taylor, provided him with drink to bolster his resolve, and attempted to poison her husband days before the attack. Her behaviour after the murder, calmly preparing breakfast, delaying reporting the crime, and instructing her children to mislead the authorities, was presented as evidence of calculated complicity. Witnesses, including her own children, described the chilling precision of her actions in the immediate aftermath. The defence argued that Mary had been caught in a sudden quarrel between two men who'd been drinking heavily, and that she neither initiated nor participated directly in the violence. They urged the jury to consider the possibility of her innocence, painting her as trapped in circumstances beyond her control. Yet, as the jury listened, the weight of the evidence, the affair, prior poisoning attempt, and her methodical conduct loomed over her like a dark cloud. The stage was set for the jury's decision, a moment that would determine whether the calm, composed figure of Mary Daly was guilty of orchestrating one of the most shocking murders in Clonbrock's history. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury began deliberations on Mary Daly's fate. Every whisper, every glance from the packed benches seemed magnified, as though the walls themselves held the weight of the crime. The evidence had been damning. The illicit relationship with Joseph Taylor, the attempted poisoning, the calculated instructions to mislead the authorities, and her unnerving composure on the morning after the murder. The question now was whether the jury would see her as a conspirator or merely a woman caught in circumstances spiraling beyond her control. After 50 anxious minutes, the verdict was delivered: guilty of murder. Yet, in an unusual gesture, the jury issued a strong recommendation for mercy, perhaps swayed by her poised demeanor or the presence of young children left motherless by the court's decision. Mary remained silent as the sentence of death by hanging was pronounced, her calmness unwavering even in the face of imminent execution. She offered no words, only a steady gaze, as though the weight of history would speak for itself. Her appeals and petitions for reprieve were firmly rejected, despite hopes that the jury's recommendation might influence the Crown. On 9th of January 1903, Mary Daly faced the gallows, meeting her end with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout her trial. Joseph Taylor had been executed 2 days earlier, leaving a haunting emptiness in the community as justice, however grim, had been carried out. In the months and years following the executions, the case of Mary Daly became a story recounted in hushed tones across the villages and towns of Queen's County. It was a cautionary tale of passion, betrayal, and the consequences of choices that twisted ordinary lives into tragedy. The fields of Clonbrock, once simple and quiet, became a symbol of the dark shadows that could linger behind seemingly respectable doors. For historians and true crime enthusiasts alike, the story remains a stark reminder that human emotions, lust, jealousy, and desire, can lead to acts of horror even in the most ordinary settings. Mary Daly's case was not a sensationalized fiction. It was real, brutal, and tragic. And while decades have passed, the echoes of that fateful June night continue to resonate, whispering the dangers of secrecy, the consequences of deception, and the chilling reality of human frailty. This was more than a murder. It was a story of morality, ambition, and the dark undercurrents that run beneath the surface of seemingly simple lives. For the people of Clonbrock, it would never be forgotten, and for those who study it today, it stands as one of Ireland's most haunting historical true crime cases,